When I was a player in Curse of Strahd before DMing it for myself, I was pretty new to D&D, and as much as I liked roleplay and exploration, my favourite part of D&D was, and pretty much still is, combat. So when we got to Vallaki and had our first ever 4 to 5 hour session where we didn't get to roll initiative once, I was a bit gutted. And it's not just me as well. I've since DM'd Curse of Strahd, and one of my players, my sessions were a bit shorter, more like 2 to 3 hours. One of my players said as well that they were kind of gutted there was no combat when they got to Vallaki. I know what you're thinking, and you're going to say there's an argument for session 0 and explaining that Curse of Strahd isn't a combat-heavy campaign compared to maybe some other campaigns, but still, Vallaki is intentionally, story-wise, not supposed to have combat, at least initially. But I wanted to give a few ideas of potential combat you could insert in for players who maybe want more combat in their D&D. Greetings fellow Mist Wanderers, my name is Steve Morgan and this is DM of the Mists, covering all things Curse of Strahd and Ravenloft. Rather than just throw out a bunch of ideas for combat in Vallaki, I think we need to address very quickly Vallaki's deal and give an overview of the situation there. It's not as simple as saying, oh, I'm just going to throw in a monster and, that's it. It's not as simple as that. So Vallaki is the biggest settlement in Barovia. There's 3 settlements. There's Village of Barovia, which is likely to be visited first, then Vallaki, likely to be visited second, then Kresk. And the whole thing with Vallaki is that it's safe initially. It's supposed to be sort of like a safe space. It's a walled town, and there hasn't been any sightings of Strahd or any of Strahd's minions for decades, centuries, I believe. But the situation there is tense. The Baron rules a bit like a tyrant and puts on mandatory festivals that people don't enjoy. People are supposed to enjoy them, that's kind of the rule. And there's another family who's plotting a coup and wants to take over Vallaki for themselves. So initially it's supposed to be safe, but then things like the festival and the feast and some of the other events happen, or the coup, and then everything kicks off. I've seen it described as a powder keg. But initially, it's a safe space with little to no combat. And this is baked in. If you read the book, you'll sort of pick this up for yourself. There is potential for some combat later on. There's the Rictavio's tiger event, if the tiger escapes. There's the walk the house basement of skeletons and some cultists in it. And of course, the infamous coffee shop with a vampire spawn. Need I say any more about that? But usually, for the first few in-game days in Vallaki, there's probably none at all. And I think it's kind of like a delicate ecosystem is probably the best way to describe it. Any combat sort of thoughtlessly thrown in can complicate the dynamic in Vallaki. For example, if something happens and it involves a fight with the guards, then could that complicate things with the Baron and Isaac and the guards as a whole? If combat happens and it's to do with Lady Wokta's book club and the cultists, could that affect the coup later on? And with D&D, this is the thing that if these things happen, we roll with the punches and we kind of just go along with it, and that's the whole point. Every game plays differently and different people have different experiences of when the coup is triggered, or if the coup is triggered, what happens with the Baron. Maybe he's hated and attacked straight away, maybe nothing ever bad happens to him. But obviously you might not want to necessarily create an encounter that then causes it all to happen or collapse or what have you. So I urge caution and advise that you be careful if you are planning to add combat to Vallaki, not to just sort of shoehorn or throw something in without giving it much thought. But the reason I suggest adding combat is I've read some stories of groups that stay in Vallaki for many in-game days. They hear that the festival is in a few days' time, so they might think, right, we best stay put, we best not go anywhere. And this could be multiple sessions without combat. And I remember reading an anecdote once on the Curse of Strahd subreddit where somebody said they had 8 sessions in a row where there was no combat. To me, as a D&D player and a DM, that's kind of like, oh my gosh, I can manage 1, 2 at a push, but 8? No, I don't know. Some parties might be okay with that, especially those who aren't big fans of combat, but others maybe not. And I know what you're thinking. Vallaki's complicated enough already, and I'm suggesting you potentially add more to it. And I completely understand if you don't want to add more to it. I think that's the idea of this video is keep this all in mind. Maybe have these in the back pocket so that if you are running Vallaki, your players arrive, there hasn't been combat for a while, you might think, you might come back to this video and you might think, oh, actually I can add, this one thing, sort of tides them over, they've had a bit of combat, and then, you don't have to worry about it for a while. I'm going to pitch some sort of what I call my main ideas first of all, then some mod guides, then some things that I did, and then just some random ideas. So hopefully there's a bit of a mix of things. My main ideas, first of all, are probably as close to raw rules as written, vanilla Curse of Strahd as you can. And they're probably the easiest and best things you can do in the situation, to be honest with you. The easiest solution, as far as I'm concerned, is urge them to go outside of Vallaki. For example, the Martikovs give them the winery quest. So the Martikovs in the Blue Water Inn say, we haven't had any wine, please can you check out what the situation is there? Or the old bone grinder, if your players passed it without going there, maybe they're sort of urged or ushered back there. And then if they do that, even if it's just back and forth the lake to sort out the whole Arabelle Bluso thing, even though there's not much time outside of Vallaki at that point, you could maybe just insert a random encounter, not actually random, it's from the random encounters in the table or whatever encounter you want to add, but you inserted it, it's not random as a dice rolls kind of dictated it. And then, that's it. They've had their bit of combat and they go back to Vallaki and that's fine. But then, of course, if they go into the winery or the bone grinder, then there's going to be bigger, more intense combat there anyway. And if your PCs, your players are reluctant to leave Vallaki, maybe have some NPCs kind of tell them it'll be fine. They could say, if it's the Martikovs, they could say, well, the next festival's in 3 days or however long it is. I'm sure you'll be there and back in time. The winery is only so many hours away. Plus, we need wine for the festival. It's pretty urgent. Another sort of easy enough idea is that if you look in the house occupant section of Vallaki, different houses may or may not have different things in them. They can be empty, or they can just have a random Barovian Vallakian family in there, but they can have swarms of rats or Vallakian cultists. Now, perhaps when they're walking down the street, a random NPC says, oh, I thought I heard something in that house, or maybe they hear it themselves, and they go to investigate, and they fight either some rats or some cultists, then that's another way to sort of scratch the itch of combat doing it that way. Of course, if you do the cultists, you've got to bear in mind that opens up the whole Lady Wakda's book cult thing, possibly earlier than you want to show it, or play that hand, if you will. So maybe doing the rat thing would be easier. Plus, I don't think it then undermines the whole thing of the Baron trying to keep Vallaki safe, because it's just a rat problem. Let's move on to the mod content. So there is a popular mod guide giver called MandyMod. I'm sure if you're brand new to researching Curse of Strahd, you probably haven't heard of her, but if you've been doing it for any amount of time, you've probably come across her guides or seen people sort of sing her praises. She actually adds at least 2 settlements or two more buildings, areas to Vallaki. One of them is an orphanage, and this is sort of bolted on to the Bones quest, where Father Lucian says the bones are missing in the church, can you go find them? Milivoj the Gravedigger was the last one to know anything about it. And then the idea is that instead of seeing Milivoj in the grounds, sort of, sorting out graves, he's at this orphanage and there's a child who's possessed named Felix, and they have to fight Felix's demon. I've not run it. When I ran Curse of Strahd, I kept it very, especially for Vallaki, I kept it quite close to the book. I didn't want to overwhelm myself even more than I was already feeling overwhelmed, because there's kind of a lot going on with Vallaki. But I think if I were to, when I run Curse of Strahd again, I will add the orphanage, and there's the combat encounter in that. I'll include a link in the description to the Reddit post about it, plus I think there's a fancy DM's Guild guide now, where you can get it on DM's Guild as a fancy looking PDF. MandyMod also has a Reformation Centre, which is essentially Vallaki's jail. I had a quick look at it, and I don't know if combat is kind of baked into it, other than the fact that, well, it depends on the circumstances. If they're trying to break out because they've been arrested, or if they're trying to break somebody out, then combat may happen. I'll include links in the description to that as well. You could add something alongside Blinsky. I actually found quite a few options on this. So I found an adventure somebody made called Basement of Lost Toys, where there's a basement underneath Blinsky's shop with some problematic toys. A lot of them are Modron stat blocks reflavoured as evil broken toys, which is pretty cool. I'll include a link in the description to that. And while I was researching this video, I also came across 2 on DM's Guild, Blinsky's Toy Shop and Blinsky is No Fun, which both look interesting, and I'll include links to those as well. Sanguine Rose. This is not just a map, but an adventure by DM Andy, the popular Curse of Strahd map maker. So not only did he make the map for it, but he came up with the adventure as well. This involves Ernst, who's Lady Wakda's main sort of servant. The overview says this adventure details the role of Ernst plays within Vallaki, along with the Keepers of the Feather's secret war against Strahd and his minions. It takes place in Vallaki, in a new location, the Sanguine Rose, the only brothel in town. And it may not contain any combat, depending on how things play out, but it could do. Some of the stat blocks included are thugs, spies, there's an incubus and a succubus, and Ernst is modified as a cambion, which is pretty cool. And again, I'll leave a link in the description. Let's move on to stuff that I did and added in my Curse of Strahd game. So I didn't do any of the Blinsky adventures I just previously mentioned, but I did add evil toys. So after they found Piddlewick 2 and gave Piddlewick 2 to Blinsky, I added the Piddlewick 2 sort of had influence over some of the toys there. And I used the Caranet stat block from Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. And minor spoiler now for Witchlight. Just going to give it a little pause so that if anyone's really concerned, they can skip ahead or switch off. There's a really creepy looking monster in that called a Living Doll. And so I had a couple of Carionets and a Living Doll. And they had a battle outside Blinsky's shop. I think I found a map where it's Blinsky's shop and the road outside, which was great. I did an attack at the Blue Water Inn. This was much later on, actually. I think this might have even been like post-festival, post-feast, where post-coup, so Vallaki changed anyway and is kind of more ripe for combat. And I like the idea as well of actually showing the Blue Water Inn map and having a combat encounter in there rather than only describing it as sort of theatre of the mind, because it is a good layout and a good map. And I just had it that Strahd was fed up that the players at this point were comfortable in Vallaki and that Blue Water Inn was a safe space. Not only was the Baron gone, but Lady Wachter and her cultists were defeated as well. So it was something quite small, I think, just some swarms of bats attacked. And they, alongside Solstar and Yevgeny, the two wolf hunters, were fighting the people who were attacking. There might have been some vampire spawn as well. I'll have to try and remember. I'll dig out the map and have a look. And it led to a really funny moment as well, which I talked about in my Funny Moments in Curse of Strahd video, if you're feeling like you want to watch something a bit more lighthearted and where I just regale my own and other DMs' funny moments. Another thing that I had planned, but it didn't happen in my game in the end, is I planned to change what happened to Leo Dilisnya. Now, in the Curse of Strahd lore, Leo Dilisnya is a pile of bones in a chest in the main bedroom of the Wachter house. However, in the novel I Strahd, he's not a pile of bones. He's turned into a vampire spawn and entombed alive. In vampire spawn standards, he's not actually alive, but you get what I mean. Somewhere on the Wachter house estate, and I homebrewed it, that there was an additional room in the cellar that was secret and not even known to the Wachter family. It was kind of known by Fiona's ancestor, but by the time it had gotten to Fiona, it had all been forgotten and they didn't even realise that there was this vampire spawn in the tomb. Instead of having it as the vampire spawn stat block, I was going to have him be a nosferatu from Van Richten's Guide, but with the sort of element that you have with vampire spawn where Strahd can control him. If Strahd becomes aware of Leo Dilisnya's reappearance, he can control him like a spawn, like you would any other spawn, like the consorts or whatever else. And I thought this could be cool if, say, for instance, Leo Dilisnya does some sort of deal saying, hey, an enemy of an enemy is a friend, we're on the same side, we both want to take down Strahd, and then Strahd realises, and then suddenly Leo Dilisnya turns on the players. You might be able to make use of some of the random encounters listed in the Dungeon Master's Guide. I'm referring still to the 2014 version. I've not yet picked up the 2024 versions of the core books. It is actually my birthday soon, so who knows, hopefully I'll get some of them then. And things like a pickpocket, bully guards, and maybe they're bullying random Vallakian commoner, or maybe like a Vestal or a Dusk Elf who's come into the town for some reason. Maybe there's an angry mob and protests and the PCs have to deal with it before the guards arrive, things like that. But again, as I kind of said near the intro, just beware of consequences. For example, what happens to that pickpocket? Maybe if you're using MandyMod's Reformation Centre, that could be a good way to sort of signpost people to there. If there's bully guards and the PCs decide to fight them, that's going to complicate the dynamic and the relationship with the Baron and Isaac, where they're again at risk of being exiled. A few other ideas I came across, some of these are just kind of I found on Reddit, some of them are ones I just came up with on my own. I saw a really cool suggestion of the grey statue of an impressive man facing west standing in the town square is actually a stone golem under the control of Strahd. I'm not sure if there's more to it than that. I just saw somebody suggest it. I don't know if there's an adventure tied to it or anything, but I'll include a link to that comment of the post I found it on. You could use an escaped skeleton from the Wachter house just wandering down the street in Vallaki. Could be a way to get the players wondering, where did the skeleton come from? Who's it tied to? Who's a necromancer? Who's created it? Of course, then there's the risk that it, opens up the whole coup thing earlier, as mentioned. In my Curse of Strahd homebrew video, I actually had Lady Wachter's and her cultists' devil worship go one step further, and they were able to summon devils into the domain, such as bearded devils and a chain devil. So having some of those could be an option. This would probably make more sense after Lady Wachter's coup, which is what I did, but you could potentially do it before, I guess. Maybe a magical experiment that Victor has done gone wrong from the Burgomaster's mansion. Maybe some of the skeletal cats escape. And then looking at like just the sort of Curse of Strahd random encounters table, you might be able to just use some of the random encounters but have them as attacks on the town. A werewolf attack, maybe Scarecrow's attack, and that's a good lead then to Berez, as well as the nature of the Martikovs in the Blue Water Inn. You could even go as far as Berserkers and Druids and a Revenant, but does it make sense? Why would Berserkers and Druid, the mountain folk, attack Vallaki? Why would a Revenant be wanting to go in Vallaki? I think those kinds of people will be more on the outskirts, more outside. And that's it, really. Hopefully some of those ideas work for you. There's a nice mix there of some stuff that's fairly low effort, like I said, just swarm of rats come out of a house. Not just low effort, but low impact, low consequence of actions kind of thing. Then there's some sort of mini adventures people have suggested, and then there's just some sort of things that I did and random suggestions. Have you done any of the things I've suggested, especially some of the adventures? Did you add any of your own? How did it go? Did it cause any problems? Did it work well? But please let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear how it went. Upcoming videos. I put it on hold because I was ill recently, but my Fated Allies, alternative Fated Allies of Curse of Strahd video, which includes some people from Curse of Strahd and some people you could add to Curse of Strahd, that will probably be my next Curse of Strahd video in a couple of weeks. On the Ravenloft front, I'm doing things like Factions of Ravenloft, which will probably have some sort of tie-in to Curse of Strahd, because you've got things like the Keepers of the Feather. And I want to do Warlock Patrons of Ravenloft as well, so that could be handy for Curse of Strahd DMs. I'll probably talk about some of the ones in Curse of Strahd, as well as wider Ravenloft. Could be a good hook if you're thinking of doing a sequel campaign after Curse of Strahd that opens up into the wide domains of Dread, like what I'm actually doing with my home game, and what inspired this channel and the videos. Then you might be able to do some things there as well. If you have a Dark Lord in a completely different domain, and Barovia is the Warlock Patron, well, that leads itself to a sequel, doesn't it? And we'll leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Wanderers.